All right, hello AP World History students. So I'm not with you today. My apologies again about that. I am leading a school session up in St. Cloud. But what this lesson is going to be, this video and then another shorter video called a crash course video by John Green. This is about the second half of the French Revolution, the messy part of it. And so we're going to sort of watch this thing fall apart, and we'll look for changes and continuities as we do as historical thinkers. And then I'm going to ask you to kind of try to pull together some big picture observations from the end, right? So if we look at our targets, I can explain what derailed the French Revolution. That's really a lot of what we're doing. I can thoughtfully analyze the legacy of Napoleon Bonaparte. Now, I think we really did that in our mock trial. So that target, I think we can already kind of check off, but we'll kind of do it. We'll do another mental rep through that today. And then our big one that we'll step back on at the end, our long-term learning target for this whole unit, I can evaluate revolutionary moments in the light of God's story. So that's our work today, guys. It's an interesting, meaty topic, so let's just jump right in. So to kind of frame this up, let's recall that the story's already started. In fact, we already know the beginning of the story. Well, we also sort of know the ending of the story already. The liberal phase, as we'd call it, the classically liberal phase, that's sort of led by the bourgeois kind of merchant class that's feeling put upon by the old, by the ancien regime, the old regime where the clergy and the nobility held all the power. We recall that. And they throw this off and they have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And like we've talked about, it bore many resemblances to the American Revolution. And today we're going to enter into the radical phase. We'll kind of glide past the directory phase. That's more detail than we need in our course. And the Napoleonic phase we again looked at in the mock trial. So like we know the beginning and the end, but this radical phase is partly what makes it so distinct from the American Revolution and such a different kind of story. And that's what we're going to examine here. So let's talk about how this turned. This new system, this new constitution where there was now a national assembly, right, of the people, and it shared power with a constitutionally limited king. So Louis XVI is now having to share power. This pleased, the people who were controlling the assembly, the kind of the bourgeois class of it. But there were many radicals who felt like it hadn't gone far enough, all right? The most radical group is called the Jacobins. And so a Jacobin, this is a word that still exists today. A Jacobin the connotations are like nasty, violent radicals who want to overthrow systems. And I suppose the Jacobins of that day, more or less kind of fit with that. So the Jacobins were radicals on the question of equality. They were radicals on the question of not wanting a monarchy, wanting to sort of like expel the entire monarchy altogether, and trying to basically get rid of the olds that were sort of like keeping them trapped in old and unequal and unfair, unjust systems, and trying to sort of let the world begin anew, sort of based on reason and kind of quasi-utopian or just flat-out utopian ideas about how things could be. And so, at first, this Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen, the Jacobins or the radicals are like, well, it's better than what it was before. But once this is the new boss, right, this is the new system in charge, then they're sort of turning on this and they're saying, well, we want to allow non-property owners to vote, or we want to further limit the rights of the king or get rid of the king altogether, right? And as this is happening, and as the revolution, the phrase we use is like the revolution begins to eat itself, right? So at one point, in the first stage of the revolution, it appears that the revolutionary and the National Assembly are sort of united against the olds, and that's more or less true. And now that the olds are being swept away, they start to turn on themselves a little bit. And as there's more and more rhetoric about getting rid of kings altogether and not wanting to share power with Louis XIV, there's all the other kings of Europe, the monarchs of Europe, especially neighboring nations like Austria or Prussia, or what was called the Holy Roman Empire, or even Britain. They're kind of like, yeah, this is interesting, right? And especially as the French radicals are saying, what they're proclaiming are universal human rights, and they're claiming the universality of these ideas. They're saying, this isn't because we're French, this is because we are human beings, right? This is all Enlightenment thinking. And, again, these other kings are saying, hold your horses on those ideas, right? I'm not sure I like these ideas very much. And as other kings in Europe are like, I'm not sure. And as it's sort of like seeming, it begins to look like Louis and his wife Marie Antoinette, like those guys are like, yeah, we're not sure about this either, right? There's worries that like they are actually kind of seeking help behind the scenes from other kings in Europe to sort of put themselves back in power or support themselves or protect themselves. The National Assembly says, well, we are not going to allow for other nations to meddle in our internal politics and our internal business, and we want to spread these universal ideals. And so they kind of declare war on everybody in Europe. I mean, it starts with Austria, I believe, but pretty quickly everybody gets involved, and they say, well, we're not going to let you deal with this. And the National Assembly, in the sort of like, they're whipping themselves into this frenzy of like, we have to protect ourselves and we need to spread these universal ideals. And at a certain point, King Louis and Marie are like, I think I just remembered I have a dentist appointment I have to go to, right? They try to sneak their way out of France, and they get caught. And then everyone's like, oh, look, they tried, we caught them. And it seems like they are betraying, or they're traitors to the National Assembly. They are arrested, and the handwriting's on the wall at this point. And so now we're at war, and war has this thing of like tending to escalate tensions, right? And so not only do we have these ideals, and not only is there this thing of like we have to get rid of all the olds, and there's these traitors in our midst, and the king himself is a traitor, and there's all these other countries here. And so what that sort of does is it creates this weird thing where it's like everyone who raises their hand and says, I'm not sure I want to totally abolish all religion. It's like, what? Who are you loyal to, right? Who are you? You're giving aid and comfort to the enemy, right? Like, are you on our side or are you on their side? Or people who are like, well, I think a constitutional monarchy is actually a good split system, right? Sort of like what Britain has. It's like, what? Who are you loyal to, and which side are you on? There's just this like these narrowed eyes of suspicion on everybody, and the National Assembly is melting down. And as the National Assembly is sort of melting down and the loudest voices are being heard, this provisional system is put in place where it's like, okay, temporarily, we're going to give dictatorial power to this Committee of Public Safety, a great euphemistic term. Because it's this period of time is remembered for its total lack of public safety. But this Committee of Public Safety is dominated by the Jacobins, and it's dominated in particular by Maximilien Robespierre, who's the loudest of the radicals. And so now the radicals have the wheel, all right? And they have dictatorial control of the National Assembly, which means they have dictatorial control of France, and they are executing this war. And so they are winning out they're tasked with winning the war and finding the enemies in our midst. The enemies in our midst, for beginning with King Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette, but also like anyone who's like talking about trying to sort of keep some system where they share power, or people who are trying to like moderate the revolution. They're like, no, you have to be all the way in. You're either with us or you're the enemy, right? That's the spirit that this turns into over a couple years. And the Committee of Public Safety says we're going to sort of build all the people who are trying to slow progress, right? We're going to bulldoze past these guys, and we will set in place a new order for France. And not just France, for the world. You're welcome, planet Earth, right? We are going to sort of, again, end the monarchy, end religion, end any systems and ideas that are connected with those to sort of bring about the new age of reason at last. So they shut down churches, they seize property from churches. They create a new calendar, because the old calendar has these weird, irrational anachronisms built into it, and it's named after Roman gods and all this kind of stuff, and it's kind of religion-y. And let's replace the clock, which is kind of strange and not rational, and we'll build a new system of time, a decimal system based on tens, a new system of dates, and a kind of what's called a cult of reason, like a cult of today the way some people talk about science with a capital S, like this is the new religion, you could say, like this cult of reason to replace Christianity, like we are abolishing the olds and establishing the new, making way for something new and something better. This radical phase, to kind of pull it together. The people dominating it are the Jacobins, again, the radicals. And the Jacobins draw their support from the urban poor. Now, why do they draw support from the urban poor? Is it because the urban poor hated, religion that much, or the urban poor hated the king that much? Well, sort of, not necessarily. It had a lot to do with the Jacobins in the name of equality. We're saying we are going to give you food, right? So we're going to we will seize your property. We'll seize property from the rich, if need be, and give food and feed the poor. And when we have the poor on our side, there's a lot of poor, and the poor will rise up. And so when we have them on our side, that's the wind at our sails, so to speak. That's where we get our political energy, in a sense. The radical phase is marked by this nationalism, this is really being uncorked for the first time truly in modern world history. Like what happens when you sort of whip up a nationalistic frenzy in people. And we'll talk in a future lesson about how that worked in particular. Philosophical influence is Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which we've talked about before, and you will read about for your homework reading for next time. And the control at this stage of the revolution is under the Committee of Public Safety, specifically this figure of Robespierre. Now, things go haywire. In this two and a half year period, it comes to be called the Reign of Terror, because this is a period of time where if you ended up on someone's list as an enemy of the revolution for whatever reason, all right? I mean, maybe that meant you just want to restore a full absolutist monarchy, maybe. That certainly would make you an enemy of the revolution. But most of the time, the people who were victims of the Reign of Terror didn't want something like that. They were, maybe they were reactionaries, but they might just be moderates, right? Or people who were like not totally with the radicals. The most dramatic move that was made was they took their king and queen who had been under arrest and they just executed them. So the king and queen are executed, which is a dramatic move, which will absolutely get the attention of the rest of Europe, right? The rest of Europe's like, okay, everybody out of the pool, this is getting ridiculous, and we're going to sort of step in and clean up the situation before these ideas start sort of infiltrating everywhere else, because that's game over for all of us. But of course, it's tens of thousands of other people are killed or imprisoned as political prisoners, right? Like I write, they just were insufficiently radical. That was their crime. And in doing things like, cutting off your king's head and holding it up, they're saying, like the revolution will not be complete, say these radicals, until they have dethroned the king of heaven as well as the kings of earth. Again, this is really some out there stuff. It runs out of gas. They literally eat themselves. At a certain point, Robespierre himself ends up being guillotined, which is some kind of irony, right? But this thing, it just runs out of. It runs out of gas. It eats itself, or the people just cannot live in this chaos. At some point, they start saying, "Anyone, someone, something else. Can we get ourselves out of this moment? Right? This is a little bit crazy." So let's do a quick check-in. I'll read the stimulus. We look at the citation first. We see it's our guy Robespierre himself. He says, "The great purity of the French Revolution is precisely what causes both our strength and our weakness. Our strength, because it gives to us the right to the public interest over private interests." So the people are more important than private interests, right? Our purity gives us our weakness because it rallies all vicious men against us. All these nasty people from outside France and inside France are rallying against us. We must smother the internal and external enemies of the Republic or perish with it. Now, in this situation, the first maxim of your policy ought to be to lead the people by reason and the people's enemies by terror. Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible. It is therefore an emanation of virtue. All right, so terror is an aspect of virtue because you're using it against your enemies. It's not so much a special principle as it is a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to our country's most urgent needs. Okay, this passage articulates which of the following principles? A, from each according to his abilities, to each according to his needs. B, might makes right. C, the end justifies the means. Or D, the government that governs best governs least. Which of these aphorisms or maxims summarizes best what Robespierre is saying? The end justifies the means. We have to do the terror to protect the purity of our revolution, right? We have to do that. We have to do these things that are against the law in order to protect our beautiful law. This is this kind of stuff that radicals and fools say, right? Or maybe that radicals say and fools believe, right? The law is the law, and it ought to apply to all. And he's saying, no. The people outside of us, right, who are threatened to us, they must face terror. All right. This is where we meet Napoleon, and we learned about him in our mock trial situation. So Napoleon rises to prominence during these wars against the rest of Europe, and he's extremely successful and adept as a military leader, and he would continue to be until he's finally ousted, finally, in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo. All right, so one thing to know about Napoleon is he was a extremely gifted military thinker in general, ahead of his time, revolutionized warfare. Okay, that's fine. The positive and negative legacies, which again we explored in our mock trial. Right? In many ways, he did implement or put into place some of the best ideas of the French Revolution. And some of the best ideals of the Enlightenment are really kind of implemented in certain ways in France, and then they're introduced in many other places as he's through warfare, as he's expanding throughout Europe. The negative legacies, it ain't democratic, let's put it that way, right? It's an absolutist system, and he's sort of uncorking nationalism, which is going to be a force for great destruction, let's put it that way, in Europe's history. France is perpetually at war. It's a weird, bitter thing to say, like he's the culmination of the French Revolution, because it's like, I don't know, right? But it's not wholly negative. I don't think we should think of Napoleon as a wholly positive or wholly negative figure, like we say in our class. It's complicated. When we step back and look at overall effects of this revolution, right? Because again, Napoleon takes power, it kind of stabilizes until he is ousted by other military powers in Europe, and that's the end. So the French Revolution did not produce a stable government. It did not eliminate the monarchy. It didn't utterly eliminate Christianity, although it weakened the monarchy and it weakened Christianity. In France, at least. It had all kinds of effects. It did uncork some really powerful ideals. Ideals about universal human rights, about equality, about laws based on reason, not based on feudal privileges. And I think as much as the other kings of Europe tried to kind of make things go back the way they were before, they were never really able to do that. That toothpaste never went back in the tube. People who were introduced to this wanted a greater say in their government. The old bits of feudal nobility and special privilege were being brushed away at this point. Under Napoleon, the French introduced things like public school systems, right? Schools run by the government for every child, right? Paid for with taxes collected from everybody. The metric system, which is sort of, mathematically an improvement on the older systems. Now we stick to our old English system for our own funny anachronistic reasons, but not because it's mathematically clearer, of course. France, religion was really weakened in France, and France is primarily atheist today. It's still, the Catholic Church is a close part of the identity of French in terms of French nationalism, but it's not really something that's practiced by most French people. So I'm going to ask you at the close of this to watch another video with a different perspective on this, and it gets into a little bit different details. And then I'm going to ask you on Google Classroom to go in and write in your response here to the question, what would you say is the biggest lesson that we as students of history should take away from the French Revolution? There's a great many lessons here, and I want to encourage you to just read what other people have to say too and respond to theirs as well. One last thought I'll leave you with. The movie Beauty and the Beast. Remember the movie? Lovely movie. I just want to inform you that were it real, the historical reality would be all of our little friends who had been transformed into teacups and clocks and all that stuff would have died shortly after the movie ended because they were nobles in revolutionary France and they would have been guillotined. And so with that, I want to leave you guys and wish you a great Tuesday. Good luck with the rest of your work today. Take care, guys. See ya.